welcome everyone, and it is such a delight to finally have in-person lectures at UDRI almost after 2.5 years. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ellen Dunham-Jones here at UDRI. Professor Ellen is the director of the MS program in urban design at Georgia Tech University. She is also a co-author of 2 books on retrofitting suburbia. And through her research, she has worked towards this movement, which works towards revitalizing and repurposing um, suboptimal suburban spaces. And through her work, she's been able to prove that these communities can be revived and transformed into mixed-use development, which promotes connectivity, which promotes community, and which promotes sustainability. And before I hand it over to Professor Ellen, I just want to set a little bit of context about what is happening in the Mumbai metropolitan region and why her work is relevant and why our talk today is so important. So we all know how fast our cities are growing, right? And the pressure it puts on all the resources. But if we were to see it in context, a third of our urban population in the MMR lives in informal settlements, and Greater Mumbai, which is the city of Mumbai, and 2 of the sort of older peri-urban areas are the ones which have the highest population, highest percentage of these informal settlements. So why is this happening? People are coming to the cities, but we don't have adequate housing stock to house these people, and they end up staying in informal settlements. When you look around, you see construction everywhere. Buildings are being built, houses are being constructed, but are they the right mix? Are they the right stock? If you see, 14% of the housing stock is vacant, and it's not even available for renting. You know, 21% of that stock is being used for commercial purposes. Residential buildings being used for commercial purposes. So there is a big disconnect between supply and demand. If we look at our transportation infrastructure, we have the coastal road being built, we have metros being built, we have like connectivity from the city across the bay to the eastern side, the Trans Harbour Link coming in, and there are multiple, multimodal corridors that are being planned. It's all good. Our regional plan is trying to connect our city to the peri-urban areas and the mainland. But what is not happening is that, employment opportunities are very limited in these peri-urban areas. They are still dependent on the city for jobs. And as a result, there are long commutes that happen. And there is a lot of burden on the transportation infrastructure, even though it is public transportation. So these peri-urban areas are mainly bedroom communities where people are still traveling long distances. So all these issues need attention. But like you said, these are opportunities as well. These are new growth areas. This is the time to do it right. This is the time to do it in a way that we build mixed use communities, and we build adequate variety of housing stock for everyone. And this is the time to incorporate sustainable design principles and people centric approaches. And those are the sort of principles which are universal. Those are the principles that bind us all. And that is what we are hoping to learn from your experience, those tested learnings and how they apply in the Indian context. So with that, I'd like to invite you. Welcome.
India is growing so much, you probably do need to actually still start some new satellite cities. In the US, that is not the case. We have so many surface parking lots in the US. If we built 2-story buildings on a quarter of our existing parking lots, we would meet our housing needs for the next 50 years. We don't need to tear down another tree ever again in the US. We are at that point. So I am solely focused. Urban design is, for me, for the US, it is not about, oh, the city's kind of broken and tired. Let's start over and we'll start a new, shiny, brand new city over here. No, I think urban design, what I'm interested in teaching is how do we go in and repair the existing places, give the places that need a boost some help, and actually correct some of the mistakes, quite frankly, that we've made in the past. So it's really layering solutions to different multiple challenges onto yesterday's urbanism. And then it's really situate those solutions into a locally specific urban framework of public space. Connect public streets and parks and plazas and creeks and watersheds. You know, it's really focusing on what is the urban framework of public space and make those high performing and engaging places to be. So when my co-author and I, when we wrote our first book on retrofitting suburbia, it went to press in 2008. If a project was doing anything to reduce dependence on the car, you got in the book. That's where the bar was. And that's still probably, to me, the most important challenge. But what became obvious at that point, we had 80 case studies. I told you I have 2,500 now. There are so many that are happening in the US now that communities are increasingly demanding, well, while you reduce automobile dependence, what are you doing to improve public health, to support an aging population, to leverage social capital for equity, to compete for jobs, and then the big one with climate change, add water and energy resilience. So we wrote the second book because there were so many case studies that were more ambitious, better designed, and more impactful. So those are the challenges that we chose to focus on. There are plenty of, there are others. I'm not saying those are the only ones or the correct ones in any one situation, but those are the ones I focus on. So the first, job one, disrupt auto dependence. And this is all relative to the US, but I mean, it's just, we have such a mismatch of the planning and the zoning that's in place still assumes that everyone should have a car and we should be designing for cars, even though half of trips now are less than 3 miles and could easily be a bike ride, especially now that e-bikes have really been taking off. So in blue are all the different kinds of things, the urban design strategies that I think those of us in urban design know we want to try to incorporate. And there are a number that I think are really important, especially I think because in India you are very likely still going to be building places where the market today is going to demand that you provide parking. But always try to design, whether you're designing a parking lot or designing a parking garage, design it as a future building site. Try not to let the sewers go diagonally underneath it. Make them hug the building and then go out to the street. Design parking decks. We are now building in the US, not all the time, but some of the time, parking decks that are deliberately flat decks. The ramps can be removed and become a courtyard in the future. You go a little higher floor to floor, and so you're anticipating that eventually it could become office or residential. So everything as architects, too often we sort of think of, my job is done, when the complete perfect building is all done. The building everything gets retrofitted over time. And figuring out those ways to try to anticipate. We don't know what the future will bring, but we know there will be change. And can you design to incorporate some of that? So one of the most ambitious examples in the US of redesigning and redeveloping, in this case, a 4-mile stretch. And I apologize for not converting to metric. I'm too old to do that at this point. But and really dramatically transferring trips from a highway to transit is the entire goal of this project. And I'll explain it a little bit more. So this is an 8-lane highway, Rockville Pike. And the condition around it, I mean, here's that highway, here's a strip mall, and you see typical condition, 5 times as much space for the parking as for the building. Very common. The zoning codes require you to have 4 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. So that is what most of the US looks like. You still get some taller office buildings and you get some green, but it's just this, there is a metro station, but it's very underused because once you get out, I mean, this is like so not a walkable place. I've made students go there and walk it, and it's miserable. So this 30-acre piece is what it used to look like, and here's what it looks like. That was in 2018. They've actually now built some taller office buildings. Very much been urbanized with now a new walkable grid of streets. It's got a mix of uses, really great ground floors, very fine-grained retail, very pedestrian-oriented, to reward the pedestrian eye with lots of greenery that's also doing tons of stormwater capture under the sidewalks. And even the rooftops, lots of solar, green rooftops. That's actually an urban farm for the residents. And this is all just happening right here. Now, every one of those dotted red lines are new public streets built on private land and paid for by the private land owners. You'd think they're crazy. But so the county, the public sector initiated the project by contacting the 6 major property owners here and saying, we want a new plan. We want to make more use out of the transit station. Those property owners all owned other properties in the Washington, D.C. area. This is about half an hour outside of D.C. And they knew that walkable urbanism, they get almost double the rent, that the market loves more. And it used to be very auto-oriented, but nowadays walkable and mixed use and fine-grained retail, that attracts employees. And even more so now with work from home, the offices really want to be in places like this. So the property owners actually said to the county, hey, great, give us a chance to insert a walkable street network. So it was the property owners themselves, and I think 6 was kind of a sweet spot. More than that, it would have been too hard to get them to agree. But one property owner, he's not going to make this area walkable unless he knows that his neighbors are doing the same thing, so that you really get enough of a network. So they're doing all of this, and then once they get enough of the new street network in, then the county is going to put the highway on what's called a road diet. It will go down from 8 lanes to 6. And they'll have bus rapid transit running in the middle, making it even more access to the train stops. So this now is that, and they're doing it along a 4-mile corridor to create a 4-mile linear city. And they're requiring 25% of the new housing has to be affordable, but in exchange, the developers get to build much, much tall, up to 30-story towers. So that's really part of the whole sort of trade-off. Now, my own students, this past semester, not exactly the same thing, but for the last 3 years, my studios have been working with a suburban county right next to Atlanta and working with one of the county commissioners and with the planning department. And we agreed this time we also were working with our transit agency and VIA, which is a micro transit company. So VIA provides on-demand van taxi service. It's not door to door, it's intersection to intersection. And it's super affordable. They partner with a public transit agency, and what they are really useful for is providing that last mile connection to rail stations or bus stops, that they can go that extra distance that helps get up, and especially in lower density, more spread out suburban areas. So we picked Scottsdale, Georgia, has some not very good connectivity. It was a lot of old and former industrial sites, so it's sort of big, really big parcels. And it sits about 1.5 miles in 2 directions from 2 rail stations. So, and it has a major, very important, unique grocery store, completely immigrant run, just this massive, amazing regional destination. But everybody drives there because it's not close enough to the train. So I had divided my students into 4 teams. So here's the existing and here's our proposed, and a variety of different ways of, with the microtransit, you want to establish a mobility hub so that it's that location where you make the transfer from bus to van or to bike or to scooter or to walk. So each of the teams located where they would put a mobility hub, densified around that mobility hub, and explored putting in car-free housing, which is rare in the US to design it from scratch as car-free housing, new construction, but is now starting, and is the first development out in Arizona. The same developers are doing a project just starting now in Atlanta. So we wanted to explore some of that. So I'm going to only show this team. So the first thing we did was we met with the community and had the county commissioners, the local politicians. The students were asking community members, what is it you love about your community that you want to make sure we preserve? And what is it you'd like to see changed? And what are you afraid that change is going to do to your neighborhood? So we got a lot of input. I mean, the fact is, in school, you never get enough community engagement, but at least we did get, I think, quite a bit. And the students went back and forth to meet with the neighbors and talk with the neighbors. When this particular team went, they focused on this intersection, which currently, it's not a very useful photo, but the intersection currently really divides it into 4 quadrants. It doesn't unify them. It's actually difficult to cross. And I mean, I must say, after being in India now for a couple of weeks, I feel like, oh, this one is simple to cross compared to most Indian intersections. But in our context, this was a pretty divisive intersection. And so that's exactly where they put the mobility hub. So they put the mobility hub where then buses can do a little loop and drop people off. You get the vans can come in. They also put in daycare, senior care, coffee shop. Of course, they had a second level with a soccer field up on top. Really trying to make that a social space. And these buildings next to it happened to include a veterinary hospital, there were a couple dog-related businesses. So they've turned their parking lots into a dog park. So people, while you're waiting for the bus or the van, you can watch the dogs, which is always fun. and flipped the parking to go back into a vacant building behind. They also, on the site, discovered that in the middle of this very large block, when these apartments were constructed, they'd flattened the land and pushed all the soil and created a cliff, very typical suburban development pattern. And so the cliff kind of dropped down, water runs off, and there's a little creek. And it's just a kind of, they could see some footpaths of evidence some people had been walking. They said, let's make that a real trail, and let's get the car-free housing along the trail, so that the people who are willing to live car-free are rewarded by, they get to be right on the trail, they don't have the noise, the pollution of the cars, and then they connect, there's already an existing trail that comes over here, so they connected their trail, all the sort of knitting around the project with the mobility hub in the middle. They put the car light housing over retail along the roads, because they said, okay, people, if you want to have a car, you have to live on the street. That seemed fair. And then this is a big rail yard where our train systems, where the trains go to sleep and get repaired and all of that. And our transit agency told us, they said, we're having a labor shortage. We would like to explore building workforce housing on our site, so above the rail yards, and they included some of that. So just a variety of kind of proposals, but very locally oriented, and ultimately very much about reducing automobile dependency, especially because it's ironically, the transit agency, they said that 90%, they are the transit agency, and 90% of their employees drive to work. So we're trying. The year before, my studio had focused also in the same county, but this time along a 5-mile long arterial corridor that was mostly built and designed in the 60s and 70s, has not seen any new investment in 40 years. It's become quite rundown, but it has a vibrant population of mostly immigrants, mostly East and West Africa and the Caribbean. So it's the cheap land, and there are a lot of sort of entrepreneurs, but it's in pretty lousy condition. So, and we called it high performance suburbanism because actually my studios, we always combine the urban design students with, we have a degree in MS in high performance buildings. And those are the students who they usually have an architecture background, but they are the ones who are doing detailed and deep studies into energy efficiency, daylighting, stormwater, all the sustainability performance metrics. And so they are each team has one high performance building student and and usually 2 urban design students. So they're working together, and I'll show some of how that played out. So Aishwarya Mogankar, a UDRI alum, was on this team. And so this road, here's this 6-lane suburban arterial road, and this just, old, pretty forlorn, it's barely, there's a sort of a side, it's really a shoulder, it's not a sidewalk, no curbs. I mean, it's just not a great place. Who here knows the difference between a street and a road? Anyone know the difference? Use, actually. So a road, think of a country road. A road's purpose, at least as defined in the US, is mobility. Get you from point A to point B as quickly and safely as possible. A street, think of a city street. A street's purpose is access. Access to jobs, to retail, to shops, to homes. So very different character. It's not about moving people quickly. It's about moving them safely and giving them lots of access. And what the history of a lot of suburban big arterial roads is they were designed as roads. It used to be, this was a country road. It was eventually widened and turned into this big suburban corridor and intended very much to help to facilitate more redevelopment of the farmland into developed areas, which it did, but then it also was zoned commercial alongside the edges. And then it becomes what we refer to sometimes as the monstrous hybrid. It becomes a strode that no longer provides mobility or access well. It's the most congested traffic because every trip it has to go kind of on it. Everything is a cul-de-sac off of it. It's very difficult to cross, and the access is very difficult to go one side to the other. So they're really not doing a good job. So this team got two sides of the strode, and part of their goal was they said, okay, we want to make this back into a street. And there are number of two colleges over here, and yet there was no student housing, no real place for sort of student life. So a lot of what they did, they analyzed how many average daily trips on that highway and realized it was actually way oversized, absolutely legitimate to reduce it down to 4 lanes and put bus stops in the middle, create easier to cross shorter distances in between. They knew this one was a stretch, but they wanted to propose it anyway. There was a creek that goes under the highway, and there's sort of an ecological corridor, so they made an ecological bridge so that animals and people could actually cross safely, and that bridge would be so visible it would indicate to drivers, slow down. You're entering now a new zone. So anyway, really making a much more walkable, pedestrian-friendly, and sort of student-oriented place. So improved public health is another major challenge. Lots of things we could and should be doing. People tend to think of the suburbs because they're greener as being healthier. In fact, suicide rates are highest, car crash deaths, especially of young drivers, are really high. And the US is in a loneliness epidemic. And it is especially the elderly and the teenagers, because they're the ones who don't drive and are feeling trapped. So lots of different challenges. This team, their site, this team chose to focus on, for health reasons, on the issue of food production and trying to really integrate more food production into a transit and trail-oriented site. So the site, they were at a rail station. It's actually the end of the line, and that rail station was really designed as just a big parking lot. It's next to some neighborhoods, but they're not even connected. You can't walk from here to there. It's insane. That's a cul-de-sac. You cannot get, you can't get there. We had one student who kind of got lost and trapped. He couldn't get out. But so the students took all that space and said, all right, we're going to make parking garages alongside the highway. And then that freed them up to design a plan with a food street and a whole lot of, use all the roofs for red crops, orange crops, light green crops, dark green crops, kind of managing. They had a lot of urban ag, a lot of restaurant row along that, and calculated that they were able to produce 56% of the food needed for a mixed-use community at a train station, and reduce water usage and lots of other things. Another big important challenge, leverage social capital for equity. The suburbs have tended to produce a private realm that is beloved. Most people love their home. And a public realm that looks like the corridor that I was sort of showing you. We sometimes call them corridors of crap, because that's kind of what they look like. And we'd argue that post-pandemic, placemaking is more important than ever. People are so eager to connect, feel part of a community. Again, it's part of this loneliness that is really, severe loneliness is the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It really impacts health. So lots of different strategies. Here again, just a little bit of the analysis that we did on this particular corridor with a lot of the immigrants and really a vibrant community and with a lot of great social potential, and yet they were complaining that they just didn't have places to gather other than little restaurants. And those were thriving, but they needed more kind of big places. So this team they were assigned a large site with 3 very large strip malls, and this was all pretty much just a sea of parking. But in analyzing their site, they found that across the corridor was an Ethiopian community center, and just behind their site and slightly off axis was an Eritrean community center. And they said, well, let's kind of connect them. So they established a connection. They've made a major entrance into their site directly across from the one, and another one coming across, and then put a sort of a little park, made a little boulevard with a linear park system to also further connect the two, and that becomes part of a main street, and they kept a couple of the buildings that already had more social infrastructure in place. So the big one, climate change, adding water and energy resilience is just so important. In terms of the suburbs, this image, I think, says an enormous amount about how here's Philadelphia before suburbanization and all the creeks, and after. What happened to the creeks? They were mostly put into pipes, and that was 60, 70 years, sometimes 80 years ago. Those pipes are failing, and the combination, and they were sized before climate change, and we have more severe storms. So when people say, why is it flooding? That tells you a good part of the story. So again, lots of different strategies. You have to read the book to get more on that. But one of the strategies that is becoming more and more common, and I love when I see these, are creating stormwater parks. So this one is an example of a shopping mall that was built on top of, right immediately adjacent to a creek. That's the pipes of where the creek was put. And so over the time, the pipes failed. There were massive floods in the 90s. And this particular shopping mall was actually, its form was surrounded by parking lots. Its form was absolutely suburban, but it was located in a small downtown of a working class city in Connecticut. And when it flooded, it just devastated the whole downtown. There were 2 back-to-back floods. Almost all the ground floor shops closed. It just killed the downtown. So they finally were able to get enough funding to demolish the mall. They daylit the creek. So here's the old pipes. They're tearing them out, and they daylit the creek. And then they took the whole property and designed it a little bit like a green bathtub. So in dry weather, it's a green occupiable park, but it's designed to be able to take a bath, which it does when there's a major storm, but it now collects all of the stormwater from the downtown. So over 200 downtown properties have been removed from the floodplain, and that enabled their train station and their public housing to qualify for funds to be renovated and improved. So it's really, we see a lot that in the re-greening projects, you're creating an amenity, an asset. You're improving, even though your focus might be ecological, you're actually having a real estate benefit that often triggers redevelopment, and that's been the case here as well. One of my student project, sort of trying some of the same kinds of strategies. So again, they'd had a big parking lot, strip mall site, pretty much mostly dead strip mall. And again, the site had been flattened with sort of cliffs around, and so it had 2 creeks and a fairly large floodplain area. So the students decided, all right, instead of seeing that as a problem, we're going to make that an opportunity. We're going to make a stormwater park that is designed actually to be permanently wet in the middle, but can flood, and make that really the center piece of the whole project. The designers said their first design, the designers said, well, let's put office buildings, tall office buildings next to the highway, and they'll have the visibility and everything. But the high performance building students said, oh, no, you're not putting those glassy towers facing west. That's going to jack up the air conditioning and the energy cost. Bad idea. So, it's the dialogue between the high performance building students and the urban designers that led to a substantial redesign of the massing of the project to make it perform much better. Now, the first time that I worked with DeKalb County, we worked on 2 dying shopping mall sites. The typical shopping mall in the US are mostly 1 story, and then they'll have 2 to 3 story anchors, the department stores at the end, and then just a sea of parking. Again, lots of parking around. In this case, one of them was in the middle of its watershed. The other was at the top of its watershed. So we spent a fair amount of time of this. The students are taught how to really think about what are your strategies of which do you prioritize? Storing water, soaking water down into the ground, or slowing water. Reality is all 3 of those strategies are always important, but they have different importance whether you're at the top or the middle, kind of where and what you do. So in this case, this team looked at an old historical map and found, there used to be a creek right down through the middle of the mall. And they chose to daylight the creek and create a series of parks that would become really their park front property, lakefront, really nice. They have some of their, that would help pay for the fact that they weren't using every bit of land. They kept 2 of the department stores and reused those because those have a lot of embodied carbon, and they're at least built out of concrete, and you can adapt those pretty easily. And they removed the big retaining wall and restored the original hydrology to slow the water down before it gets to the creek. So lots of good strategies on that. On the other mall that we were looking at, one of the teams they just did one big move to improve the energy performance. They tilted the degree, they shifted the grid, oriented 21.76 degrees west of true north, because at least at our latitude, that's enough so that you're never getting direct western sun. You're making a much more comfortable walking environment, which again, when we're trying to really make a walkable place, that outdoor thermal comfort is extremely important. And so a lot of more attention to the microclimate. And that's this one. Competing for jobs, as I said, is another, the suburbs. 80 to 85% of jobs in the US are more than 5 miles from the central business district. It shocks most Americans to know that, because you think of the high rise, but they have the high rises. Yeah, well, you actually have a lot of high rises out there too. They're just not, they're spread out. So a lot of, in particular in the US, it's the aging office parks, which are now getting infilled and becoming mixed use. So one of a really, I think, very successful example of that is this one. This used to be an IBM campus, was the high tech of its day, 300 acres. And what the designers did, so in black are the existing streets of the office park, and they're wide. They've been kind of re-landscaped, but they're very wide, suburban, car-oriented, and that's where now the parking garages, still a couple parking decks, those are on the black streets. In between, in red, are all the new streets that they inserted in the middle of the blocks, and those are, in some cases, purely pedestrian. In most cases, a car can still go on them, but very narrow, slow. These are pedestrian-oriented streets. And they've created then this great public realm, and now there's a lot of housing up above that is now attracting Amazon, Google, Facebook are all building 20-story towers here. And that's all. This one has just been growing like mad because it provides, they can get the parking and they get the walkability. So the high tech companies are actually coming back in droves. But those are the high tech, high paying jobs. The fact is, in the suburbs, you really need a lot more of the low-paying and low-wage jobs. The suburbs in the U.S. now are much more diverse than the stereotype you see in the movies or the TV shows, but they're very segregated. There are rich suburbs, there are poor suburbs. The rich ones are getting richer, the poor ones are getting poorer. And the suburbs traditionally were always the home of the middle class. The middle class is shrinking in the US, and we're seeing that play out in the suburbs. So there's also tremendous need to really focus on the need for more social infrastructure and, frankly, more jobs that are at that lower income wage. This one is a great example of a mall outside of Atlanta where the owner, after there was a massive influx of Hispanic residents, they rethemed the mall, Plaza Fiesta. We see a lot of ethnic malls around the country. In this case, they took one of what had been one store and subdivided it into 140 little 10-foot by 10-foot stalls, like a Mexican mercado. So now it's 140 immigrant small businesses. And the owner says he's getting double the rent. And meanwhile, you've got 140 entrepreneurs starting their own businesses and serving a population that, frankly, wasn't being well served by the national chain store. In fact, whenever our state government proposes any kind of anti-immigrant legislation, this parking lot is where the rallies are held. I mean, it really, it is the heart kind of a community. It has become, it's privately owned, but it has a very public purpose. One of the student teams looked at the project in there, the Plaza Fiesta project, when they were planning this one, because this community also was very relatively low income. Most residents were commuting very long distances to get to jobs. So with the mall dying, they decided to keep many of the buildings and re-inhabit them with a lot of job incubators, with healthcare, with urban ag. Most of the housing they put in was live-work housing, so an opportunity for a family to also have a workspace and bring in a lot of childcare and other kinds of strategies. So And I think last one is just, support an aging population. Probably not so relevant in India. It is actually okay. In the US, it's very much, and especially it's in the suburbs. So it's my generation, the baby boomers, who the suburbs were basically built for. And the boomers now are retirees. They loved the suburbs while raising their kids, but now that the kids are gone, they don't really want to maintain the single family house and the big yard, and it's a lot of work. And so there's a lot of interesting proposals. And it's not as if all Americans can afford to live in senior housing when they get elderly, but it's still a growing number. This is an example of a mall that was built in a small town. When the mall died, it's replaced it with a mixed use and mixed income. There are different income levels here. And it centers on a town green, and there's a lot of retail apartments above that sort of surround. The role of these little town greens, we see this in almost all of the mixed use communities, heavily programmed, lots of performances, speakers, plays, whatever, yoga classes, farmers markets, movie nights. So in this case, and most of the housing, the yellow, is all senior housing. So the seniors are really integrated into the life of the community. They can also walk very much. This is the main street along the waterfront. So and little detail, because this was built on a former wetland. They never should have built here in the first place, but they did. So lots of underground work with basins to catch stormwater, make sure zero runoff ever again from this site. All of the structures by pilings that had to be pounded pretty deep into the soil. Well, while they're putting in those pilings, they also put in geothermal pipes, and they're bringing up warmth from the earth to heat the sidewalks, because in the winter, this is Minnesota, and it freezes, and the sidewalks get very slippery, but they're using the Earth's energy to make sure the sidewalks don't freeze, and so the seniors are less likely to fall and slip. So